Boom, we're pre-recorded, and this is something we had actually talked about last year, the possibilities of the derivative bubble that was taking place in Deutsche Bank, triggering a global economic collapse throughout the rest of the banking system. Now, some of this is going to come down to what we believe the relationship and the corollary response to some of the alternative assets, such as Bitcoin, might look like in the future. But more specifically, around a week and a half ago, Deutsche Bank was investigated, and a lot of their documents were basically rummaged through and gone over because of their money laundering connections. Now, this is not something that's new to the financial system. HSBC just a few years ago was fined hundreds of millions of dollars for their connections to money laundering. Again, the AML, KYC that these banks are supposed to be going through, they're not doing it. So as you can see, the National Monetary Fund previously deemed Deutsche Bank the most systemically dangerous bank in the world. Now, in 2008, if you were to look back at some of the ideas that, I guess, kind of sent the avalanche of failures down the economic line, was the lack of liquidity in the fiat systems. These banks are all connected through interbank lending. When one bank goes, they tend to go all together. So here you have the professor of economics and law, William Black, who says, and he knows why and contends this same idea as well, Deutsche Bank, or DB as it's known, possesses what is called the National Championship Bank, and it is the largest bank by far in Germany, but it's actually the largest criminal enterprise in Germany. This is quite the statement because VW is also such a massive fraud over the last few years. He also goes on to quote, says, "It is insane that we allow Deutsche Bank to go from fraud to fraud to fraud. They cheat on everything else you can possibly imagine, and typically they are getting caught, which is not a very good sign in terms of the competence even as thieves. Even in the United States, there have been the reluctance to crack down on Deutsche Bank, and the reason for this is they know the interbank lending scenario and the lack of liquidity in the fiat game." So the New York commissioner basically tried to crack down on the office of the comptroller of the currency in Deutsche Bank, the premier banking regulator. He actually sought to impede this. The reason being is he disparaged that the New York folks said that there really wasn't that big of a problem and that it proved to be a bunch of lies. Obviously, this was not the case. Deutsche Bank was then raided by German regulators last week on more allegations of fraud and money laundering. So Deutsche Bank is essentially the epitome of the banks of too big to fail. So now, as you have it, the banks that are allowed to fail, the regulators will not be allowed to regulate them properly. Professor Black says, "Why you should care if Deutsche Bank impedes the effective regulation everywhere, because God only knows the next thing that they're going to do." And this is a really big problem in the banking sector itself. Here, as the little guy, you're constantly run over by the fact that these banks are able to take advantage of the inflationary currencies, which essentially rob everyone, and more so rob the people at the bottom of the pyramid, effectively. They're also only given barely smacks on the wrist for creating global fraud. If you were to even have a fingernail dipped into what some of these companies have been able to get away with, you would be behind bars for life sentences, and that is unacceptable. It's the effective term of, we no longer live under the rule of man. No, well, actually, wait, hold on. We no longer live under the rule of law. Yes, that's what it is. It's now the rule of man, which means if you have enough money to afford to get yourself out of those problems, you can do just that. And that's unacceptable. It means that the rest of the laws don't apply to those who run at the top. And it is a direct contradiction to the reason why we have laws in the first place. It makes no sense. So here he goes on to say, this is going to continue until something dramatic changes, and eventually this will probably cause the next crisis. And we agree. It's something we've said for the last year or two. Now, a big part of the question comes down to, well, what's the corollary response to Bitcoin's price having a potential systemic crack come in the economic system, especially in the fiat world of interbank lending? Now, this is something we've postulated over a bunch the last few years, and one of my main thoughts here is the contention of the real fact that not that many people know that much about Bitcoin or fiat currency in general. A lot of the times, the problem comes from understanding what the medicine is. So here, for instance, right, if you don't know that the solution to the fiat money system might be a decentralized money system like Bitcoin, then you're bound to go running to something else, like the US dollar. And we've seen this time and time again in the collapsing emerging markets around the world. They don't know that there's an alternative option, so they turn to the US dollar, unrealistically not realizing the fact that it has the same problems that their currency has. And this quote has been used many times before. It is just the cleanest dirty shirt in the hamper right now. Again, I think that Bitcoin's price will likely corollary follow a negative systemic downturn simply due to the fact that there's not that many people that realize what this asset is the medicine for. If people realize that already, we would probably see a significantly higher price, and then we'd have a different story, but that's not the case. People often don't realize they need to take the medicine until they're sick and dying on the doctor's bed. So here he goes on to continue to say, it says there will be a large bailout in these circumstances most likely, but this could trigger the next economic collapse. When the largest bank and the third largest economy in the world is completely dysfunctional, the German economy is most likely to go into recession as well. This is one of the potential sources of the next recession, and you can see lots of warning signs that there's a serious recession ahead, and it's likely relatively soon. If you're a big fan of Gary Vee, you will know that exact same sentiment is coming out from his voice as well. So when you have other entrepreneurs saying, hey, you should get ready for the next recession, and other banks creating major fraud and barely getting slaps on the wrist for it, these are the signs of the times, and it's important to be aware and to buffer yourself from these coming collapses. Everybody's been getting comfortable living cushy lives and cushy jobs. This is not the time to be doing that. This is the time to be learning how to save and produce and be an effective member of society. Otherwise, you will likely be taken out with the wash. So again, I like Professor Black's statements here, who goes on to the regulator from the S&L crisis, says the whole system of weakness itself is because it gets caught in this big lie that has to pretend that Deutsche Bank is a bank instead of a criminal enterprise. And I really like this sentiment here because this is exactly what the governments and banks have become. They are mafiosa criminal enterprises that are doing exactly what we didn't want to take place, but now at a global scale. We need to remember to focus on who the bad guys are here, and they are the large-scale enterprises. It's not capitalism, it's a corrupt system. That means the hierarchies that have been climbed not by competency and not by conscientiousness, but by sheer tyrannical and criminal behavior are the ones that we need to look at, and those themselves have almost unanimously around the world become that of the governments and the banks. They are the most dangerous perpetrators of these offenses, and they are offending, or I guess, and tyrannical behavior that could essentially affect the entire world's population. Again, I love Professor Black's ideas here. It says, I'm going to give you the advice that you get after the recession, before the recession. Pay off your debt, all that you can, and do not keep borrowing except under certain circumstances that you're going to buy a home. And if that is prudent to purchase, do that. Buy a car when you can with cash whenever possible, but try to be a net saver. And it's exactly what I just said. These are the times where you're going to want to learn how to buffer yourself as an individual, an entrepreneur, to be a productive and saving member of society, because we are about to enter hard times over the next few years. And if you do not know how to do that, you will hit the bottom and it will not feel very good. This is Tio with the Arcane Bear. We're signing off for the rest of the evening, reminding you that you are the most valuable asset in your life, and purpose, responsibility, and your relationship to your family are deeply enjoyable. Hey, give us those, whatever, it doesn't even matter. Have yourselves a